This is the Cameron Journal Podcast, our weekly news show. Very excited to see you all. I am not going to lie, I am a little bit tired this week. As people who follow me on social media, at Cameron Cowan on Twitter in particular, um, I am doing my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and this week I have a packet due, and so I've been focused on that. I'm also teaching a writing class, also for my MFA, and the first two sessions were this week, so it's been a lot of work and a lot of prep and all this type of thing, and so it's been a lot to handle, and it's Friday. I'm teaching my class. We usually do this on Thursdays. I'm teaching my class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I moved it to Friday, and that'll be the case for the next month. If you ever have questions about programming notes, about the live stream of the weekly podcast, or if I'm taking a week off or whatever have you, definitely check on social media. I post all of those there as well. If I know I'm taking a break, I will announce it on the podcast, but sometimes I decide to take a break after after the podcast is already aired. So, so a little tired this week, little run down, little run out, but we're here and we have a couple news stories to talk about. I've got an interesting collection of books that I'm reading for critique for the MFA this time. One of them, The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock, is it's interesting, it's terrifying. I'm looking forward to writing about it. There's a couple other ones I'm looking forward to getting into, like this one called Dear Miss Metropolitan, which I haven't even started yet. That's what I'm going to be doing after this. But it looks interesting. I've wanted to read it for a while, so we'll do that. I'm also looking forward to reading this one, A Land More Kind Than Home, which is probably going to be tomorrow's book. So, and then somewhere I have to fit in a little bit of Toni Morrison. But I love Toni Morrison. You never have to convince me to read Toni Morrison. So I'm always excited to read Toni Morrison. But so it's been a bit of a long week. It's been a long week in the news as well. The Democrats are still fighting about the infrastructure and reconciliation bills, and Sanders has taken the fight to West Virginia to get Joe Manchin on board. The U.S. is facing ever more complicated supply chain issues, which has started to reach to the White House level. And we have multiple labor strikes this week as companies try to squeeze cost out of labor to protect profits, and people are not having it, especially in a tight labor market. So I want to start with the reconciliation and infrastructure bill, because that's kind of a story we've been following for a little while. And I was reading this article on Politico about Bernie Sanders posting an op-ed in Manchin's hometown paper on Friday night. And Manchin said this isn't the first time an out-of-stater has tried to tell West Virginians what's best for them despite having no relationship to our state. And he maintains that Congress should proceed with caution on any additional spending, and I will not vote for a reckless expansion of government programs. And he said, no op-ed from a self-declared independent socialist is going to change that. In the piece, Sanders lays out how his proposed Medicare expansion and drug pricing reforms could help West Virginia, a historically poor state that is aided by many federal programs. Sanders also makes the case for climate action, paid leave expansion, and other programs in the bill that could face omission if Manchin insists on shrinking it. Sanders also specifically targets Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema, Democrat Arizona, who both oppose the $3.5 trillion number and are trying to shave it down. It says here, Poll after poll shows overwhelming support for this legislation, yet the political problem we face is that in a 50-50 Senate, we need every Democratic senator to vote yes. We now only have 48. Two Democratic senators remain in opposition, including Senator Joe Manchin. Sanders and Manchin both serve on Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's leadership team and come from polar opposites of the Democratic caucus. They are often diplomatic, even when disagreeing in public. Last week, however, Sanders began pressuring Manchin and Sinema to speed up their languid negotiations on the final piece of Biden's agenda, which also covers healthcare and education expansion. The two gave dueling press conferences, then Sanders held an availability with reporters last Friday to continue leaning on Manchin and Sinema. Obviously, we know that this has been going on for a while. This isn't new, and Sanders is correct. In the current political environment, with the fact that there are only 50 senators on each side, you need everybody on board in order to make things happen. And Manchin and Sinema know that. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is the $3.5 trillion bill is actually $3.5 trillion over 10 years, which means actual spending is only about $350 billion per annum. And that's something that hasn't been talked about enough. That the spending is over time. It's not like we're just going to cut a check for 3.5 trillion and that's the end of it. It's actually over a lot of time. It will probably be added on to as the years go by or scaled back depending on who's in power. And and so there's, all these the money enables a lot of programs to be expanded. And I think the most important part that a lot of people also don't understand is that thanks to some changes in tax rates, the entire bit of spending is paid for. It's not just new debt, it's actually all paid for. So that is that's something that hasn't necessarily been shared enough in the media. And it's funny that I should say that because Bernie Sanders in The Hill mentioned the fact that the media has not been doing a very good job of talking about the social spending plan. And he says here, it's absurd that many Americans don't know what is in President Biden's plan. And while cautioning that there could be many reasons for that, he launched a broadside against how the bill has been covered by the press. Quote, the reality that the mainstream media has done an exceptionally poor job in covering what's actually in the legislation, Sanders said. There have been endless stories about the politics of passing Build Back Better, the role of the president, the conflicts in the House and the Senate, the opposition of two senators, the size of the bill, etc., but very limited coverage as to what the provisions of the bill are and the crises for working people and that they address. Sanders' statement comes as Democrats are struggling to break through on the spending plan amid an intense focus on the price tag for the bill and weeks of high-profile Democratic squabbling over the still being negotiated legislation. Democrats want to use the spending bill to carry some of their biggest priorities, including expanding Medicare and Medicaid, new child care and education benefits, combating climate change, and overhauling the tax code. The specifics of what Democrats will ultimately include are still in flux as they try to figure out the size of the bill and what policies can unite their razor-thin majorities. While many of the ideas behind the spending bill are popular with voters, a CBS News poll released this week found that only 10% of Americans knew a lot about the specifics, and 57% indicated they didn't know any details about the multi-trillion-dollar proposal. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi took a similar tack to Sanders earlier this week when asked about the CBS poll, telling reporters that, I think you all could do a better job of selling it, to be very frank with you. And I think what Sanders is hoping for is that if the media did a better job of covering it, that it would be incredibly more popular. And if it were more popular, then that might be able to get Sinema and Manchin more on board with with voting for it. And the fact that people don't know that, it's a lot of money over a long period of time, but it would radically change Americans' lives. Medicare expansion would allow people to go on to Medicare at 60, not 65. Reducing drug prices would save both the government and patients money. help with childcare, universal pre-K, all this sort of thing would be a huge boon to working families. I mean, there's lots of stuff in this legislation that is for everyone, especially working people. And that has gotten lost in the whole conversation about the legislation. And so I think, that I think the media could do a better job of covering what exactly is in the legislation. And I think that would help it. I think it would help people understand what it is and make people more comfortable with it. There's been a lot focused on the cost of it, but not a lot focused on what it actually is. And the sad reality is that in the United States, we Americans pay a lot of taxes. I mean, we have city sales tax, property taxes to pay, county sales property taxes, state sales property taxes, sometimes state income tax depending on where you live, and then we have federal taxes to pay. And the reality is we spend a lot of money on government, but comparatively speaking, we get very little for it. We don't have the social safety net that usually results from this high tax environment. And so one has to wonder why we don't have those social programs. And two, we have to wonder where's all the money going. Now, these are two separate problems. Figuring out where all the money is going is actually not too hard to figure out. But figuring out why we don't have the social safety net that goes with all the money that we're spending is also not hard to figure out because it's been demonized for 40 years. So we end up in the situation where we're taxed at four different levels of government and we receive comparatively little for the number of taxes that we're paying. And this especially impacts the upper end of the working class, where if you're making good money and all this type of thing, you're paying the bulk of the bills in this country. Because the wealthy have enough money to hire lawyers to get out of the taxes. The poor people aren't really paying. So it's the people in the middle, if you're making, over 80 grand up to about half mil, those are the people that are paying the bills. And there's no social safety net to show for it, i.e., to bring up the bottom and maybe slow down wealth growth at the top. And so the difficulty with all of this is that we have ourselves in a society where we are not we're accepting living in a society where certain things are a given in terms of, your children will do better if they live in a good zip code and you can afford to send them to school earlier and all this type of thing. We've accepted that as a fact. We've accepted the fact that when you get older, your healthcare costs may bankrupt you. We've accepted not having universal healthcare and therefore anybody's medical costs can bankrupt you. These are all things that we have come to accept in our society as sort of given. But the reality is that for as much money as we pay, we could be getting more bang for our buck. We could be doing more with the money that we have and the resources that we're able to bring to bear. Instead, over the past 40 years, we've decided that wealth should flow into the pockets of the wealthy, into the pockets of shareholders, and all this type of thing. And this is the first chance we're having to actually maybe begin to get a little bit of that money back. And that actually is a great segue into our next bit, which has to do with organized labor and the strikes that are going on. There's a variety of strikes happening right now. Kellogg has a strike going with their bakers union. John Deere has a strike going with their manufacturing union. And the crew, the IATSE, the crew union in Hollywood, is about to go on strike as well. It basically is leading to a situation where you could have strikes happening all over the country affecting tens of thousands of workers. According to Bloomberg here, it says in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, unions are finding they suddenly have the upper hand, or at least more solid footing when it comes to negotiating wages and benefits, spurring a flurry of new picket lines. Nearly 40 workplaces across the nation have gone on strike since August 1st, according to Bloomberg Law's database of work stoppages, almost double the number during the same period last year. From Deere and Company's factories and Kellogg Company's U.S. cereal plants to nurses in Massachusetts and distillery workers in Kentucky, more than 100,000 union workers across a vast swath of industries are either on strike or close to it. leading some to dub this month Striketober. One of Hollywood's most powerful unions is set to strike on Monday for the first time in its 128-year history, unless contract talks are resolved. Workers are right to think the ball is in their court, said Adam Seth Litwin, a professor of industrial and labor relations at Cornell University. They need to take a really big bite of the apple right now because whatever they're going to get, they're going to have it in their mouth for a long time. A newfound forcefulness of labor unions is in stark contrast to the direction of the last several decades. Private sector unionization has plummeted for generations as some industries decamped to the largely ununionized American South, and a slack labor market made it easier to replace striking workers. Only 10.8% of the U.S. workforce belonged to a union last year, Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows. That's down from a peak of 38.4 in 1954, according to Pew Research Center. Amid threats of automation or offshoring, and companies taking full advantage of the leeway afforded to them by the courts, those dwindling unionized workers made significant concessions in past contract fights, unsure they had a better alternative. But now, employees trying to reclaim what they gave up before have been emboldened by a series of related events: soaring company profits, a renewed respect for essential workers, and rekindled political will in Washington. Plus, there's the hard truth of today's labor market. Companies in many industries are finding employees downright impossible to replace. Here are several key factors at play. And they go on to different things. One of them has to do with essential workers feel essential, company profits are soaring, there's an extremely tight labor market, and people are supporting them more than ever before. So that's fine. When it comes to um, labor relations in this country, one of the biggest things I have argued for a long time is increasing unionization, for the simple fact that when you have organized labor, you end up with much more evenly distributed wealth throughout the company in terms of pay is better, benefits are better, all this type of thing. And that's something that, the IATSE in Hollywood is facing, is that, they're, complaining about these long work hours, they're complaining about the pressure that they have been under for all of this, for all of this time to, produce films and TV and all this type of thing. And they are also, um, complaining about, pay really has been stagnant in this country for a long time. And so kind of all these factors have built together to where unions feel like now's the time to strike. If not now, when? And especially in an environment where, getting labor involved is incredibly difficult, very tight labor market. Now you kind of have a better position to do what you want to do and make things happen. And I think this is going to lead to more people wanting to unionize. I did see a story this week about there's a Dollar General in Massachusetts that's actually trying to unionize, which would be the first Dollar General in the nation to unionize. There's, I think, other workers are figuring out what workers 100 years ago knew, and that is that worker solidarity and working together as a collective is better than trying to negotiate things individually on your own where the company has the upper hand. There will always, as long as we continue to live in a capitalist system, there's always going to be tension between labor and the organization of capital. The only counterbalance to the organization of capital is the organization of labor, and making sure that labor is getting their fair share of the wealth that ultimately they are responsible for generating. It is very difficult to sell a box of cereal if there's no one to make the cereal. It is very difficult to sell a tractor if there's no one there to build the tractor. And um, and that means that they deserve they deserve good wages and good benefits for doing the actual work required to generate company profits. And although, as I keep telling people, capitalism is always looking for a frictionless return and to create return with as few frictions as possible, the reality is that we've tried that for 40 years. We've gotten to a place where capital can create a return with almost no friction, which is why wages have been stagnant, benefits don't exist anymore, pensions have not been a thing since the 70s, all this sort of thing. Um, and people are, rightly so, pushing back on that and saying, no, we're the ones that actually do all this stuff. We're the ones that make all of this possible, and we deserve our fair share. And yeah, that might add some more friction and it might add some more costs, but it makes for a better society. And this is the thing that people kind of forget is that when you have money in the hands of people, it's moving through the economy. When you have wages on the increase, people's lives are made better. When you have good health benefits, we have healthier people, we have healthier children, healthcare costs go down. Now, obviously, universal healthcare was the better option of the two, but that's not going to happen for a while. So, in lieu of that, having these things in place is important. And I think more people are going to be encouraged to go after unionization. I think, I think to some degree, much like the 1920s, 100 years ago, we may be getting into an environment where unionization goes on the increase as people try to counterbalance the effects of capital. And in the early 20th century, after the 19th century had grown these huge companies that made billions of dollars, which would be trillions in today's money, all this sort of thing. Um, that was built all on the back of workers being horrifically underpaid, having no sorts of benefits, no sorts of retirement, no sorts of like basic workplace safety regulations, child labor, all sorts of really sort of awful things. And in the early part of the 20th century, we began to have trade unions and where workers would come together and try to go on strike in order to stop companies from taking advantage of them. A lot of the early strikes were not successful. I was just watching again a documentary called Red Copper Country, which is about the Calumet Copper Company and the 1913 strike. Um, and that strike ultimately was not successful. The Western Federation of Miners came in to unionize the workers. They went on strike to stop the copper mines. The company hired in scabs from out of town in order to keep the mines working and all this type of thing. And then after a year, the strike was broken, and the company, in a sort of bit of humiliation, made them tear up their union cards to get their jobs back. Only about half of them were hired back, and to the president of the company, um, they presented him with a gold watch that every striking worker had put in a nickel to contribute to, as well as a book they had all signed. And and on a letter thanking him for his competent leadership over the course of the strike. And we have a different legal environment towards unions now than we did at the time. But those moments ultimately led to the labor movements of the 1930s during the Depression, when you had boiler workers going on strike. GM had a terrible strike in 1934, and that ultimately gave us the weekend, the 8-hour workday, basic workplace safety, minimum ages for workers, all this type of thing. And life was made better. And I think if this labor movement continues, we're entering into a similar situation where workers throughout the economy may decide that having a union is a better idea. Even last year, we had an Amazon plant in Alabama attempt to unionize. Amazon managed to stop it, but they're actually going to get another chance to unionize here shortly. I think there are other, worker opportunities elsewhere where unionization may absolutely happen. Wages are finally on the increase due to the tight labor market, and you also have this idea of you know allowing people not only to work but be fairly and decently compensated for it. And that's an important aspect of the labor movement that has been lost since the Reagan era. So, speaking of tight labor markets and things not moving around, let's talk about the supply chain crisis. Now, for the uninitiated, I'm going to take a drink real quick. For the uninitiated, um, if you're trying to import anything right now to this country, good luck, because the ports are a disaster. They've got containers piled higher and deeper throughout the West Coast. Um, they have ships sitting offshore that can't be unloaded. There is no warehouse space. There are not enough trucks to remove the containers. It's a disaster. Um, and President Biden has already said that some things may not be available for Christmas. And so in this story from Politico, we have the following. It's as if there's one universally recognized principle in American political life, is that the President of the United States should want Christmas to come off without a hitch. Surely this is one of the reasons Anthony Fauci so rapidly backed off his comment in an interview the other day that it's too early to say whether people should gather for the holiday. No sooner had Fauci relented than the national focus shifted to an ongoing crisis of the global supply chain that is clearly going to crimp the holiday shopping season, forcing the Biden administration to scurry to try to alleviate a long-running, highly complex mess. We've gone from fruitless infrastructure weeks in the Trump administration to fruitless trying to pass infrastructure and reconciliation weeks in the Biden administration. I don't know why I find this funny, but I do. Maybe it's because I'm tired. I'm starting to get punchy. Now, and attempting to make our infrastructure work week that might have to be repeated until the end of the year and beyond. As part of a push to get our logistics unstuck, the president is prodding the Port of Los Angeles, one of the most important in the country, to operate on a 24/7 basis. This is welcome news, although it might cause most people to stop and think, wait a minute, our ports don't already operate 24 hours a day? No, which speaks to the thick layer of irrationality that encrusts our supply chain. It is beyond the power of any one person to change this anytime soon, but trying to scrape off as many of these encumbrances as possible should be a national priority. We are experiencing the worst disruption of the supply chain since the advent of the shipping container era in the late 1950s, driven at bottom by the pandemic. A surge in e-commerce, coupled with a labor shortage, helped to create the conditions for a spiraling series of bottlenecks. Ships are idling waiting to unload their cargo at ports, while containers are waiting at the ports to be shipped further inland. While cargo is waiting outside full warehouses on chassis that aren't available to use to pick up other containers, and so on. In theory, there are plenty of ships, trucks, and other capacity to handle the volume, but not so much if that capacity is tied up and frozen in place. So there's no underestimating the challenge here. Everyone along every part of the U.S. logistics chain is pointing fingers at each other, and everyone deserves some blame, whether it's the ports, the truckers, the warehouses, the railroads, or other players. Yet the situation also highlights how, as Scott Lincomb of the Cato Institute persuasively argues, our logistics system is beset by idiotic policies and practices that make it hugely inefficient. There is a tendency in the political debate over infrastructure to assume that more, and more spending in particular, is better, but it matters how you're making use of what you already have. Consider our ports. U.S. facilities are nowhere near the top performing facilities around the world. They are generally less automated and less efficient than those in other advanced economies. It takes, for instance, twice as long on average to move a container from a large ship at the Port of Los Angeles than it does at top ports in China. Ports in Asia operate 24 hours a day, matching the 24-hour-a-day pace of factories, whereas until now the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach were operating only 16 hours a day. The White House made a pointed, if understated, reference to this in its recent fact sheet on its new logistics push. Unlike leading ports around the world, U.S. ports have failed to realize the full possibility offered by operation on nights and weekends. Yeah. The main culprit for this massive inefficiency is the incredibly powerful International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which has a lock on the ports up and down the West Coast. It hates automation and has won extraordinary pay for its workers. Dock workers make an average of $171,000 per year, with foremen making nearly $300,000, and strict work rules. When it negotiates contract renewals, the union can effortlessly snarl freight everywhere in the West. Work slowdowns are its specialty. As Peter Tershwell writes in the Journal of Commerce, huge cost increases, limited ability to automate terminals, chronic avoidable disruption during contract negotiations, and far lower productivity and working hours compared with ports in Asia and elsewhere around the world are at the core of the issue. Notably, the highly automated Port of Virginia has been weathering the current crisis better than its counterparts. Nothing comes easy in our current regime. The truckers have complained that various restrictions have made it difficult for them to make use of the additional nighttime hours that have already been available at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. In its fact sheet, the White House said 3,500 more containers will be moving at night, an incremental change in the right direction, but a drop in the bucket in the scheme of things. Tershwell points out that's about 3% of what goes to U.S. ports weekly. Long-haul truckers around the country need about 200,000 more drivers and have also been hit by a shortage of chassis. In the midst of a major logistical nightmare, the U.S. International Trade Commission imposed roughly 200% duties on top of Trump-era duties of 25% on the world's biggest manufacturers of chassis, China Intermodal Marine Containers. The company does indeed benefit from unfair subsidies, but the timing of the Trade Commission's action was hardly propitious. The head of the Harbor Trucking Association, representing port truckers on the West Coast, complained, "Now we've created scarcity and increased the cost." U.S. trade policy shouldn't proceed heedless of the real-world consequences to the U.S. economy. Then, as Lincomb points out, there are long-standing rules like the Jones Act, which makes it much more expensive to ship goods from port to port within the U.S., putting a premium on overtaxed ground systems. Eventually, U.S. logistics will get out of the current fix and reach a new equilibrium. Still, the crisis should prompt a rethinking of the needless inefficiencies we foist on ourselves. It will be too late to hold this coming Christmas harmless, but will serve us well going forward, whatever the season. When it comes to fixing the logistics and all that type of thing, there's not much I have to say, other than to say you cannot shut off the world economy and turn it back on so easily. That's one thing that probably the right gets about the pandemic that I think the left does not understand, is you can't just, flip a switch, turn it all off, and then turn it all back on and expect it to work like it always used to. The reason I kind of read that article in full is so there were a lot of different issues in there that I didn't know or understand. So I figured it was good for us to learn together. That's what we do here. We learn together. And I had no idea that the longshoremen were, one, getting so well paid. I might have to learn how to move a container. And two, also the fact that that the ports are not running 24 hours a day and all this sort of thing. I know the port of Seattle does not, but I would anticipate a busier port like Los Angeles to do so. I do know that when it comes to long haul trucking, that is an industry that has been squeezed for quite some time. That began in the 80s with the deregulation of the trucking industry. And long haul trucking is an industry that has begun to attract a lot of immigrants because the pay is not great. Most long haul truckers, if you're independent, you might clear six figures if you're lucky. Most regular truckers are maybe making $40,000, $50,000 a year. It's not a lot of money. You're never home. You have no social life. You're lonely. You have no social life because you're never home. Um, and, it can be really stressful on your family because, again, never home. So, that I think you're going to need to do some recruiting and bump up the pay. And to be thinking of our earlier story, a little bit of unionization there might be incredibly helpful. Um, so there's kind of all these factors that are built together. But a lot of these things are not new. The trucking shortage has been talked about for the past decade. We've known the shortage is coming. A lot of people have retired. That's just the reality of it. We also know that when it comes to, making logistical items in America, we are not necessarily doing that as much as we used to. One of the conversations that has been happening lately that I think is incredibly important is people have mentioned the fact that a lot of this would be solved if we had more domestic supply chains rather than so many international supply chains. Do I think that there's going to be any actionable movement on that anytime soon? No, I doubt it. However, that um, I do think that it is generally a good idea, and I think there are companies that, due to the pandemic, are looking at, spreading out production in a little bit of a different way, and kind of doing things a little bit differently than they have in the past. And I think there's a potential for a great kind of renaissance of manufacturing or even assembly in this country as companies try to reshore some of what's happening here. I think that, coupled with the increased unionization, could actually do some really great things for the American economy. It could do some great things for the working class, and we could get back to a place where people are actually able to advance their lives and make their lives better. Do I think all this is going to happen overnight? No. Do I think that, all of it's going to happen in the perfect way? Probably not. It's going to be a lot of fits and starts. It's going to be, this and that. It's going to be half measures here and some companies doing something there. It's not going to be uniform. But if unionization and wages can come together with an increase in domestic manufacturing, that could be a powerful combination that could solve one of the biggest problems we have economically, and that is that we are not creating decent jobs for non-college educated white men. And that presents an incredibly unique opportunity for the US economically that I think could be quite significant. Even with automation and all this type of thing, it would solve several structural problems that we've had in our economy for the past 40 years. So hopefully some of the things that we've talked about today will work themselves out over time, but it's something to think about. The last story I'm going to mention just very quickly because I'm going to move on. Um, is Shannon Paulus over at Slate mentioned an article that she was sad that Adele lost weight. If you haven't heard, Adele has her new album 30 coming out. She dropped a single last night called Easy on Me, and it's fantastic. And she rightly points out in the article that there's not a lot of representation of fat people in media. There's not a lot of opportunity for for fat, larger body people that are talented in Hollywood and other spaces and all this type of thing. So it's always kind of nice when somebody who has a different type of body than very skinny to break through and do something interesting and be able to break through the filter of oh yeah, you're talented, but you need to be, very thin in order for anyone to pay attention to you or all this type of thing. And Adele was kind of nice because it was like, oh, she's a superstar celebrity. She's super talented and she's, not super skinny. And well, now that's not the case. And she points out it's Adele's body, it's her life. Our opinion is neither desired nor required. And I entirely agree with her. But I also understand that for those of us who are not stick thin, it's always nice when somebody who looks a little bit more like us has a chance to break through the filter and do something interesting. And it's always kind of sad when, under pressure of whoever or their own ideas, they end up losing a bunch of weight and, and then kind of, rejoin everybody else. And again, it is what it is. We don't have any control. Our opinion is neither desired nor required. But at a personal level, I get what Shannon Paulus is saying, and I thought it was kind of worth mentioning. So, if you want to reply to any of the news stories I've talked about, please catch me on social media. I always like talking to you all. You all have been very busy on Twitter lately. I have been talking to everybody a lot. So feel free to catch me on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, facebook.com/Cameron L. Cowan. Um, or you can email in, head over to CameronJournal.com for all of that. I appreciate you all for watching. I appreciate you all for listening. If you're listening to the audio version of this, this has been the weekly news podcast from the Cameron Journal, and I will see you guys next week. Don't forget, it will be on Friday, not Thursday. And if you're listening to this on a podcast channel, you'll be unaffected as the podcast will appear in your feed on Saturday. Except last week when it was on Sunday because I forgot. Anyway, I'm a one-man show. Work with me here. I'll see you guys next week. Thanks much, everyone. Bye-bye.